So folks, welcome along to today's Primary Innovation webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, who should be known to all of us, and that's James Turner.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you again for hosting a Primary Innovation webinar and for working through those technical glitches at the start. And thanks to folks for coming along to join in this webinar. So this was a bit of a change of plan. Originally, we were hoping to have Willem van der Zalm present on his master's work. He's still working on writing that up, so that present webinar will be in the near future. What I'm presenting here is, because it was rather last minute, a presentation that I gave at a conference over in Uruguay that was organized by the Uruguayan Family Farm Improvement Project, which was a joint project between New Zealand and Uruguay. And there they'd taken a co-innovation approach, and so they brought together folks from New Zealand, Peru, Colombia, as well as Uruguay, to share their experiences of working in a co-innovation way. And this is the set of slides that I shared with them. So to start with, it's really around what we've set out to try and do in the Primary Innovation Program, which has been seeking to answer two questions. First, getting a sense of the effectiveness or not of co-innovation as a way to achieve impact in addressing different types of primary sector problems. And the hypothesis is that it's especially effective when you get into highly complex problems. Then the other question that we've had in primary innovation is, how is our ability to co-innovate in projects to deliver impact affected by the wider innovation system, that agricultural innovation system in which we operate, the funding mechanisms, the organizational structures, the industry structures. So the way I've structured my presentation is to go through and give a sense of how we've been answering those questions and some of the answers that we're starting to get. So at the center of that question of, is co-innovation effective? And in fact, at the center of both questions are these innovation projects that you can see, the 6 of them here, where we have researchers, industry, government working together in a co-innovation way to address different types of problems, from what we hypothesize are the less complex in the dairy heifer rearing, through to the highly complex in the area of nutrient management that Ina Pinksterhouse is leading, and also irrigation scheme water use efficiency. And we hypothesize that in those simpler problems, technology transfer should be sufficient, a simple science-driven through to passing it over to farmers, and then co-innovation is better when you get into those complex problems. So in terms of then, if you look inside each of those innovation projects across the different sectors, then another part of it is how we implemented co-innovation. And what I have here is a diagram that sort of distilled a number of the principles that have previously been presented on by Jeff Coots. We had 9 principles, and this is work that Wendy Boyce has done to condense those down into a set of sort of 5 principles that encapsulate the 9 and that we've been implementing in AgriSearch. But each of the innovation projects has in some way implemented these principles and other elements. Just to go through these very quickly, you can see that critical is taking a problem focus, and to be able to have that problem focus, you need to involve partners and stakeholders in defining the problem and developing the solutions. And that to do that, to bring those stakeholders and partners together, you need the right team. And that's the technical expertise, as well as expertise around being able to facilitate sharing of knowledge, bringing in new stakeholders, so reflexive monitors are an important role in the team, as well as brokers. And then once you have that team working together on those problems, it's about sharing what you're learning and reflecting on what you're learning very quickly. So front up early and often, and keep doing that cycle. And that fits within this plan, do, observe, reflect cycle, which is the action learning cycle. So each of those projects has implemented that in a particular way, in their own way within the project, because how it works in each project depends on the people you have in your particular context. So then, wrapped around each of those innovation projects implementing those principles as a case, they form a case study or a network That's a case study. And then we've wrapped research around those to understand how they've been interacting, how they've been implementing the principles through interviews and surveys and workshops, and then also around the effectiveness, doing methods like cost-benefit analysis, which I'll then share the results of one cost-benefit analysis that we've done on the heifer rearing project. Monitoring and evaluation has been critical to gather evidence of progress towards impact or not. And so they form that social research. How is co-innovation occurring? What does it look like in each of those cases? How have they implemented the principles? Evidence of impact or not? And then at the same time, each of those projects is made up of researchers, industry, government, who are developing their own capacity to co-innovate and taking those on to other projects. We already have a number of examples of people like MS Srinivasan, who's developed capacity in co-innovation and now taken that into another project. So if I then zoom into that question of, is co-innovation effective? Is implementing those principles effective? I'll zoom in on that case of the irrigation scheme water use efficiency. And the reason I'm using that one, which involves MS from NIWA, is that it's very well written up in a paper that was presented at IFSTA and very nicely goes through the impact of co-innovation, not only on the farmers and change on the ground, but also on MS as a researcher, how he's changed his own practice, as well as the farmers changing their practice. So a bit of context for this project. Its aim was to improve on-farm irrigation decisions by characterising irrigation demand through soil moisture monitoring and also forecasting water supply. The idea is to help farmers be able to move from using water when it's their turn in the irrigation scheme to making decisions based on whether or not they need it and whether in terms of supply and demand. And to implement co-innovation, to implement those principles, MS has worked with 5 farms in the irrigation scheme where the farmers have provided their specific farm data in real time, and they're getting that from MS through forecasts and soil moisture monitoring. And then each year the farmers come together with other farmers in the scheme and the irrigation scheme managers to discuss how they've used that information to inform their decisions around irrigation and what information is helping and what's not. So in the paper that MS presented at IFSA about this time last year, one of the key things that was observed was that this process of co-innovation helped them to redefine the problem from being one about just providing the farmers with that data to also about how they use that to make decisions and what else they need in place to help them make use of that information. So examples being having water storage was identified as critical to being able to improve water irrigation decisions. Then, as I mentioned, some of the practice change that came from co-innovation, it wasn't just restricted to the farmers, but also MS as a scientist. So he learned about what is it that the farmers need in terms of information. Originally it was around information on weather forecasting, but through the interactions with the farmers identified that also information on irrigation demand and drainage was needed. So farmers can make decisions about, am I losing water out of the bottom of my soil profile? And if I am, can I reduce that? The irrigation scheme manager, a nice example of practice change there was that for farmers to be able to make use of that weather forecast data, they needed to be able to shorten the time frame that they asked for water from the 48-hour lead time to a 9-hour lead time so that they could use that more accurate weather forecast data. And so the irrigation scheme manager has implemented that. And then for the farmers, they've changed their irrigation management, especially during the peak season. So traditionally they've made decisions around irrigation more around the shoulders of the season, but now they're being more careful about how much water they apply during the peak season, and that has provided evidence of reductions in irrigation and drainage. So the scaling up and out of that, so the impacts of co-innovation have gone beyond just those farmers that were directly involved in piloting this. So 25 farmers are now using that data for irrigation scheduling, including some of them looking over the fence and asking the farmer who's in this project, what's the drainage, what's the forecast. Then there's an example of another irrigation scheme testing technologies from this project. And another important part that I mentioned is that farmers in the scheme are sharing water storage, because it's critical to be able to store water when it's available, so you can use it later when it's actually needed. So a really nice write-up from MS and colleagues there around the practice changes that have arisen from co-innovation and how that's been scaled out and scaled up beyond those direct participants in the project. The next part of that question around is co-innovation effective is if we've got evidence that in cases it's changing the problem definition and hence the solutions that are worked on, is it worth the effort though? And in this case we've done a preliminary cost-benefit analysis of the dairy heifer rearing project as our example. So here the question is, does co-innovation lead to faster and or greater adoption? And because you're involving more people to better understand that problem, and it involves more time because you're bringing more people together and spending time up front understanding the problem, making sure you've got it rightly defined, there's a lot of upfront cost. And is that really worth it in terms of do you get faster and greater adoption? So the approach here was to do a cost-benefit analysis comparing co-innovation with a technology transfer approach. And one of the points here is that Dairy NZ actually already implemented an approach closer to co-innovation, but we were comparing it with technology transfer, which is a more extreme difference. And because the project's still underway and we haven't got ultimate impacts, we used a tool for predicting adoption and peak level of adoption called the Adopt tool that's developed out of CSIRO. And that tool helps you to develop these curves of adoption over time. So using input from experts, particularly people like Rob Brazendale, Greg Lambert, Sarah Dirks, around how the project has influenced the number of heifers that could be reared with good practice to ensure that they achieve their target weights before going back onto the milking platform. We, from that information, found evidence that was suggested with the Adopt tool that over time you would end up with quite a higher number of heifers that are being reared with that good practice, especially by those third-party graziers. So they're sheep and beef farmers that as part of the enterprise also take on heifers from dairy farmers to graze them and fatten them up before going back onto the platform, and ideally being at a target weight where they can get into in-calf. So then the question is, okay, so there seems to be a suggestion you could get greater impact based on that expert data and the adoption tool, but does that overcome the upfront costs of involving more stakeholders? So Dairy NZ involved Livestock Improvement Corporation, Beef and Lamb New Zealand, grazing companies, and also did a series of focus group meetings with dairy farmers and grazers across the country to really make sure they defined the problem correctly and we're looking in the right place for the solutions. And so you can see up front here, it's very small, but the co-innovation started out with a lower net benefit because of those higher costs associated with interacting with more people and more time up front. But because of those greater predicted impacts, very quickly, around the 7-year impact point, there's a sense that this could lead to greater impact. And so the net benefit was estimated at 12.2 million, even though there was 30% more cost up front of taking that approach with the co-innovation compared with the technology transfer approach. So at least for the dairy heifer rearing, there's a hint that co-innovation is worth that time up front for those predicted impacts. So at this point, I'd like to take a break and check if there are questions, and also put a question to people out there.
Great, thanks James. So far there are actually no questions. So folks, just get your little fingers typing there in the Q&A box. And James has now posed this question. So how would you decide if co-innovation is the approach to take? So presumably if you're looking at a new project, how would you decide whether you'd use the traditional approach or whether to use co-innovation. So let's get those little fingers typing, or if you'd like to raise your hand, I can unmute you. So that's assuming that you've got either on a telephone or you've got a little microphone for your headset. So let's see how brave people are. It's good to see that we've got a range of people joining us today. So there's no responses that I'm seeing yet. I haven't seen any hands. Oh, here we go. Ina, thank you. So at the start, she says, I take the collaborative approach anyway to make sure the problem definition is correct. What are your thoughts about that, James?
Yeah, so that's good practice for sure. And I guess what we've been looking for is the evidence that for an investor who's investing in a project, taking that collaborative approach up front, that it is worthwhile investing in that time where it looks like you're spinning the wheels, like exploring the problem. Yeah, so absolutely one of the essential principles of co-innovation.
So James, just a question for you. So at what time would you do that? So do you do that when you're still thinking about the project proposal, or do you do that after you've got the funding from the external source? So when do you start that collaborative discussions, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the idea would be before you're developing the proposal. The challenge that we're still working on is that often proposal calls are within a short time frame, and unless you sort of know what the questions are that are coming from that call, you may have limited time. And so we also like to try and build in flexibility into proposed programs to get further exploration of the problem and understanding of the problem.
Okay, so you engage with as many of the stakeholders as you can beforehand, come up with a best bet, and then once you've got the funding, then you have far more serious and in-depth discussions, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and that's what we've tried to do in Prime Innovation and in other programs as well. And I know Ina had very nicely built in an important step in her research program, that nutrient management project, around at this point we'll have gathered some evidence to understand the problem, and then we'll make a decision about what the further research will be. Doing it.
That's good. And Ian has now chimed in to say, yes, preferably before the proposal is finalised. It might be difficult to get time for that though, and she's saying that we're discussing that within Dairy NZ if we should have scoping projects. So yeah, that's good. And now Nicola has jumped in to say a complicated issue needs addressing with high risks, if not addressed, and high risks managing the change. What are your thoughts about that, James?
Can you ask?
Yeah, so it's complicated, isn't it? A complicated issue needs addressing with high risks, if not addressed, and high risks managing the change.
Yeah, so that around with those complex problems, because of the risks around identifying and understanding the problem correctly and hence the solution are greater than in a simple problem, then they seem to be the type of problem where co-innovation and investing that time up front is all the more valuable.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she's saying yes, there you go.
Yeah. So yes, and I think that is the other framing for investors, is around this helps to reduce risk in those complex, when you're addressing those complex problems.
Very good. So that's all the questions or comments for the moment. So would you like to move on, James?
Sure. So the next part of the presentation is around that second question that we had in the program, around if you've got each of those innovation projects that are working to implement those co-innovation principles, how is their ability to implement those principles and put those principles into practice influenced by the wider agricultural innovation system in New Zealand? And a nice framing for thinking about this is some work by Ruth Nettle at Melbourne University that identified, when they looked at programs taking a similar sort of co-innovation approach, that the innovation policies and structures for supporting innovation in that context in the Australian dairy sector were designed more for a technology transfer type of approach than a co-innovation approach. And that meant these projects were trying to co-innovate in a world that was designed for technology transfer, and that those individual projects became what could be called islands of success because they struggled to implement co-innovation into other projects. So that's the concept of scaling up, creating wider beneficial institutions and capacity from local to national levels to implement co-innovation in more projects. So the way we've gone about that is, again, we have our case studies, these innovation projects, and they sit within a wider innovation system that has these structures. So the actors, so that's the researchers, but also the farmers, the industry bodies, government agencies like Ministry for Primary Industries, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, and all of these actors are interacting in the innovation system. And the presence of those actors and those interactions are influenced by the institutions, the rules of the game that influence who's present, the time and resource for interacting, and who is encouraged to interact with who else, as well as the physical infrastructure, so the platforms for being able to interact and the physical buildings. And the presence of these structures are about encouraging the 7 functions that have been identified as supporting innovation in an area like these innovation projects. And commonly we'll talk about the important function of developing knowledge, and it's not just about that development of knowledge by science, but also the knowledge that's developed by farmers, by growers, by others, as well as those in government, the exchange of knowledge amongst those groups, and the coordination of those interactions. Then outside of that sort of knowledge development and exchange is the formation of a fertile ground for the innovation project to make impact. So there might be the need to form markets. So for example, MS has identified that to scale up what's happening in the irrigation project, there's potentially the need to commercialise some of the products, form markets for those. There's the mobilising of resources to all of these functions. So are they all adequately resourced to be able to support co-innovation in each of the innovation projects? Are there processes for creating legitimacy? So that's around the sort of setting of an agenda. For example, in New Zealand, there's now a strong agenda around nutrient management and managing how land uses interact with water to reduce the impacts of nutrients from the land into the water. So that creates legitimacy for the projects like MS's in the irrigation scheme and ENA's in the area of nutrient management. And then another critical one is entrepreneurial activities. That's where ideas are put into practice in the real world, and in implementing in the real world, they're tested in terms of how the market reacts, how does society react. And there's a lot of learning that happens in that real world. And an example of that we picked up was a critical success factor we identified in the Apple Futures program, where they were testing practices for reducing the number of pests and the residues from sprays on apples. So in our work with understanding the innovation system, we've identified that some areas of weakness in the New Zealand innovation system that make it challenging in the case studies to co-innovate is the lack of coordination. And MS and ENA have talked about the challenges they've encountered around being able to interact across their individual projects that have some alignment, and the extent to which there's resources for them to interact and coordinate some of their activities. There's also a lack of entrepreneurial activities. We invest a lot in the science end of innovation, but less so in the actual testing ideas in the real world, because we tend to leave that to the business activity. But we're challenged in New Zealand agricultural and primary sectors by the large number of small enterprises that lack the resources in terms of number of people and time to test ideas in the real world and learn from that testing. And then in the area of knowledge development and knowledge exchange, I've sort of alluded to it, that we tend to focus on the science end of knowledge development and exchange, but are not is effective in some areas in bringing in the knowledge of other players from government, from industry, from farmers and growers. So if we've got these weaknesses that are challenging the case studies being able to implement those co-innovation principles into their projects, how are we trying to address those? So that was the role of, in the Primary Innovation Program, a set of sector champions in a community for change. This is people who are in management level in industry bodies like Dairy NZ and Beef and Lamb, in government like Ministry for Primary Industries and Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, as well as farmers and growers, and also people in research organisations that make decisions about how research programs are designed and investment in research. So these sector champions play a key role in facilitating change in industry and organisations and in the wider innovation system. And we've tried to work alongside that community for change to evaluate and address those systemic barriers to innovation that I mentioned. So it was with them that we identified those barriers through interviews with them, through visioning exercises, and through sharing with them the experiences of each of the innovation projects. And then working with them to co-design interventions. This is where we've been working with Graham Nicholas and Jeff Foote at ESR around workshops to co-design those interventions to help address those barriers that I put big circles around. You know, what changes can we make within ag research, around how we organise research, within MPI, around how they fund research. So have we been getting evidence of changes in the innovation system? So at the moment there's limited evidence of change in the innovation system. A nice example though of success has been the inclusion of an extension framework in the Ministry for Primary Industry Science Strategy, and that extension framework includes co-innovation as a concept. MPI now encourage programs to evaluate if a co-innovation approach is needed and provide those programs with links to resources to help them implement a co-innovation approach if that's what's needed. So that's an example of starting to get system change in terms of providing incentives and tools and support for co-innovation where it's relevant. The big sort of changes that we have been seeing in the community for change have been more in the knowledge sharing and coordinated action. So there's been a lot of evidence of learning from each other, from government learning from research organisations and from industry, industry learning from government research organisations and so on. So an example of that was where one research organisation, in this case AgResearch, has developed key performance indicators for encouraging co-innovation, especially the role of innovation brokers. And other research organisations have looked at that and sort of started to explore how they might be able to implement it in their own organisation. Then there's another example of knowledge sharing that I mentioned of people like MS and others in the program who've been working in a co-innovation way, taking that knowledge into other projects and organisational changes. Another example was Dairy NZ, bringing in co-innovation more into their projects through a program approach and having program facilitators to get coordination across their many different projects. And then in the capacity area, some of the university people involved in community for change are talking about building capabilities through the courses that they teach, to build capabilities for co-innovation. So early days, but signs of progress. So just to wrap up then, in terms of where we're at with answering those two questions that we set out to answer, through a number of the case studies, and especially from the irrigation scheme project, we're getting evidence of practice change and impact. And a nice thing with that irrigation scheme project is evidence that that's not just about practice change on the part of farmers, but also on the part of other players in that challenge, as well as scientists. And also have some preliminary evidence of the benefit of co-innovation in terms of the heifer project, and we're now scaling that out to all of the other innovation projects to evaluate whether or not they've experienced any benefit or not. And then that second question around the innovation system, enabling or hindering, we've identified key barriers, and we're seeing evidence in working with the community for change that we're beginning to address these. And at this stage, we're undertaking another series of interviews to get further information on what actions community for change members have been taking to address those barriers. So thank you very much. That's a quick snapshot of some of the early learnings. Wow, I don't know, I think there's some good learnings in there from the Primary Innovation Program. Any other questions?
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, James. So first question from me, because there aren't any others at the moment, but I'm waiting for people to type them in. So you mentioned just in the previous slide, I think, about universities developing some courses to build capabilities in this area. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Because here in Australia, very few of our universities offer extension type courses that I could see that fitting into. So can you elaborate a bit on that, please?
Yeah, so an example is Marie McKenty, whose research is in the area of participatory research, extension and co-innovation. And it's really at the stages of she's sort of identified that concepts of co-innovation are something that she could include in some of the courses that she teaches on science for impact and around the participatory research. Yeah, so early days there, and I think I'd find that in New Zealand there is still limited teaching of those sort of extension type activities.
So is there perhaps another mechanism for building people's capacity apart from university, which I imagine would be a fairly narrow sector?
Yeah, so another example that we've got is within AgResearch and the Beyond Results program that's led by Helen Percy here at AgResearch. So that's developed a set of tools and methods, as well as that framework that I presented that was developed by Wendy Boyce, to provide researchers with capacity to build co-innovation into their research proposals and their programs. Another important part of that is the support for monitoring and evaluation that helps with that action learning cycle of the plan, do, observe, reflect. And so AgResearch has resourced that activity, and Tony White's done a great job of spreading that and supporting that in AgResearch. Yes, that's another example of sort of building that capability by providing tools and methods to support it. And then on the other side, AgResearch is stimulating the demand for that by requiring that all large programs actually go through using these tools at developing their proposals. So that encourages engaging with stakeholders, identifying the systems. Does that help answer?
Yeah, that's excellent to hear that AgResearch are taking that approach. So now I understand why Wendy and the co-authors wrote that paper recently about building co-innovation into your research proposal.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Excellent.
Any other questions?
No, there aren't. We have a very quiet audience today. It's obvious that you're just such a clear speaker, James, that you've left no stone uncovered.
I'd like to think that was the case. Thanks for that, John. I wish.
Oh, now Ina has asked, where could she get a copy of Wendy's paper?
Sure, I will send through a link to the Beyond Results website to share with folks, because that's got all those resources, including that paper by Wendy, which was also based on a report to Dairy NZ on what we've been learning from the co-innovation project.
Excellent. Brilliant. Well, we've covered all the questions and had, I think, good discussion on some of those. And by the way, Nicola has just chimed in to say that the Beyond Results website is a great resource, and she says thanks for that. So folks, thanks for joining us today, and thanks, James, for your very clear presentation. So I'll close the webinar off now. So thanks everyone for joining in and being part of today's webinar.